Hi, my name is Isabella Crame,
And I'm Rebecca Chan.
and we are doing a project on globalization's impact on the Chinese Me Too movement. So we're asking, how has globalization impacted the Me Too movement in China?
Some topics that we're going to cover are first the historical context, the causes, effects, and some final thoughts.
So first, let's talk about what the Me Too movement is. Tarana Burke is the founder of the Me Too movement, and it was put on MySpace, which is now taken down, but used to be a popular social media network as a way for sexual harassment and sexual abuse survivors to share their stories. There's a global culture of silencing women who have been sexually harassed and abused, and this movement is bringing the stories of those victims to the front of everyone's attention and holding harassers and abusers accountable for their actions. It's a movement to collect stories from young women and to who have been victims and victimized, and make sure that they are no longer silenced. This movement has gained traction not only in the US, but now around the world.
Some historical context. First of all, I'd like to restate what Isabella said about a global culture of silence. Not just in China or the US, but around the world, there's a global culture of silence for a various amount of reasons. Um, Women have long been seen as less than men or below men, which causes a lot of silence as well as a lot of hierarchies make women or other survivors feel like they can't come forward, especially if their abuser is someone who is a person of power. So another thing is China's long history of communism and oppression. There's a lot of state-sponsored censorship and limitations of free speech, which prevent a lot of women from talking about their stories, men as well, talking about their stories because it can be seen as very critical to the state, which is something that the Chinese government's strongly against. As well as there's a lot of sexist workplace rules, such as married women without children have to sign a special agreement promising to not get pregnant for 2 years. If that promise is broken, she can be fired without compensation, which ties into the workplace culture as well as authority figures. Authority figures and hierarchies are a large part of the workplace culture in China, which makes it hard for the survivors to come forward about their stories, especially if their abuser is their boss or a higher up. As well as the Chinese culture heavily values men over women. Um, the male dominance, there's a large male dominance in the language, such as back long ago when Mandarin first started being created, certain characters that represent power or dominant work, like field work, are tied strongly into male characters, such as the character for them or they is made up of the character for him and then an affix, as well as the one child policy made families often abort females in order to get a male to carry on their name. Another thing is when women are married, they often become a member of the only the husband's family. I know from personal experience, my mom had to fight her family in order to be a part of her own father's funeral because they thought she had married into a male family, but my mom is really cool, so she was like, no. Um, they also follow a strong patriarchal family structure, and it's largely still followed, especially in more rural areas of China. Some causes. First of all, technology and social media have allowed people to coordinate movements and connect. Technology has created exposure for the movement, and it allows people in China to be able to learn about the hashtag #MeToo movement that started in the US. Another really important thing about the Me Too movement is hearing other survivors, and globalization has allowed people to hear the stories of other survivors, which encourages them to tell their stories as well. Another large thing is the spread of culture. We know that in globalization, as the world becomes more connected, the spread of culture is inevitable. So as the movement sparks cultural change in one country, such as the US, changes can often expand it to other countries through globalization. Technology and social media. Technology and social media encourages international connections through social media platforms like Weibo, MySpace, Instagram, and Twitter that have all allowed the hashtag #MeToo movement to gain a lot of traction outside of the US. So social media presence has allowed people in China to learn about it and participate in it, despite censorship and restrictions. Social media has allowed people to coordinate this movement as well, allowing people to come together to create marches, protests, and conferences, like Izzy will talk about in the coming slides about how people are coming together outside of China. Technology as well. It allows people to travel. The use of internet, planes, and other forms of technology creates a large window for exposure, and it becomes a catalyst for that exposure in other countries, which is a unique opening beyond the state-sponsored censorship, which is often very limiting for movements like the hashtag #MeToo movement. Hearing other survivors is one of the best ways for other survivors to gain the courage to share their stories. In 2018, a professor at the Beihang University in Beijing named Chen Xiaowu was accused of sexually harassing a student, Lo Xixi. So after she posted her story on a popular Chinese social media website, Weibo, under the hashtag #MeToo, it went viral, and she's credited with sparking and igniting the China's #MeToo movement. So hearing other survivors is really important in how China was able to grow their own #MeToo movement. The spread of culture. With globalization, the culture of one country gains the ability to blend with the culture of others. In the last 2 years, the changing political climate around sexual harassment and assault in the US hasn't only affected people in the US, but it has kind of a soft power effect on other countries like China. You can see in these images, you can see the women on the left are protesting in the US versus the women in the right are protesting in China, which shows how the spread of culture in one country can directly correlate and affect the spread of culture in another through globalization, the connection of people.
So now let's talk about some effects. First of all, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, the Me Too movement in China originated on college campuses. And right now, the movement is continuing to be centered in college campuses. The movement has picked up traction with college students because the activities of students on college campuses tend to be perceived as not being anti-state and instead being targeted towards their institutions. If these protesters move outside of college campuses, they're seen as being against the state, and their movement is quickly shut down by the authorities and by censorship. So a lot of people have been maintaining their presence on campus. Also because of censorship that is being state-sponsored, the Me Too movement has largely needed to become a covert network. We have a covert network of operatives and activists, and they have adapted different strategies to disseminate their information and gather petitions in unique ways to evade censorship efforts. Globalization has also enabled them to create an international support system. So the feminist activists in China are not isolated and not limited by their state censorship. Instead, they are gaining movements outside of China and collaborating with different activists that have reach beyond the country's borders. So according to a study in 2019, 84% of Chinese women have been the victims of sexual harassment or sexual assault. And it wasn't until only a couple years ago that sexual harassment was allowed to be a reason to be sued in civil court. Before that, you couldn't bring a petition to court that you'd been sexually harassed. There wasn't a legal ramification for sexual harassment. So this brings me to the movement on campus. On college campuses, 60% of girls said that they'd been targeted, mostly by teachers and professors. As Rebecca had mentioned earlier, there's a patriarchal hierarchy and a sense that authority figures, particularly male authority figures, can get away with anything, and you would be in the wrong to report them. So young girls who are being targeted by these professors feel that they've been silenced and don't have the courage to stand up and make their stories known. But movement on campuses have ensured consequences for the actions of these professors that are targeting people. They ensure that the professors are not only removed from their positions, but also docked funding and taken off of lists for research grants, so they can no longer work in their field. On the right, there is a series of protest signs that have been created by college students and posted on campus. It's reflective of the idea that unless the person bringing the harassment charge is, quote, a perfect victim, their case won't be heard and they won't find the person guilty. That is that's criticizing the system that values male voices over female voices and assumes that if a woman is wearing a revealing skirt or anything of the like, that they're to blame. It's a heavy culture of victim blaming and of slut shaming. On the left is an image of a girl who is currently petitioning to have her case heard in court. She was raped by her professor, and the lawyer that was assisting in her case decided to stop helping her. And this is her second time going through the legal process. So now we talk about the covert movement. Since China has a strong state censorship, this movement has largely been squashed. The hashtag #MeToo has been blocked by a lot of servers, and the censorship teams have been working hard to take down any petitions done by activists. So instead, activists are using alternative methods to evade censorship. One of the ways that they've done this is they've taken a phonetic version of the hashtag #MeToo by using the characters for rice and bunny, which ends up sounding like Me Too, instead of the hashtag that has been blocked by the state. So rice bunny is now the image of the movement. Also, non-governmental organizations have been endorsing this movement. They've seen a lot of support from organizations like the Orange Umbrella and NGO Me Too. They create networks for victims and support systems. They also gather stories and collect them so that they can bring them to court once enough evidence has been gathered. And they also disseminate QR codes for petitions so that people can sign these petitions and get them spread the word faster than the censorship teams can take them down. And this brings me to international efforts. Because of globalization, Chinese feminist activists have the opportunity to move abroad or contact people who are supporters and empathizers of the movement who are abroad and have less censorship and more access to demonstrative movements. while in China, uh, demonstrations such as marches and protests are prohibited by the state. Uh, People who are outside of China, for example, the group in the on the bottom picture who are demonstrating in New York City, can organize movements that are uh, in support of the feminists that are trying to be active in China. They don't get a lot of visuals because they don't have access to mass protests or walking in the streets like we do um, here in America, like we see. But the between the covert movement in China and the demonstrations abroad, the conversation is happening and it's being raised. Uh, the anti-sexual harassment activism is at the forefront of a lot of conversations and is starting to put pressure on the Chinese government. So now, the movement going forward. One of the things that we think is going to be happening is more and more individuals who are operating outside of China are going to be supporting the feminist activists who are still in China. Basically, what they're doing is they're getting the stories of women who have been harassed in China and taking them and bringing them outside so that they can report on them, so that they can collect them, put them in anthologies, and ensure that these voices are uplifted and heard. This puts pressure on the Chinese government for continually covering these up and also allows women to have this conversation and recognize that they have global support.
And also because of globalization has the ability to weaken state sovereignty. So, regardless of how much censorship they put on the people, there's still going to be at least a certain percentage of these women, men, children who are accessing the stories of other survivors outside of China, the movements outside of China, because of globalization, social media, technology. And so we can only hope that a certain percentage of them who are able to access that will witness and see the power of this movement. And going forward, the movement will be able to grow and hopefully we will see some cultural changes.
And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.